Hi everyone, I'm Dolly Oladini. I'm C40's Air Quality Network Manager, and I'm delighted to host this joint webinar with our Network Manager for Mobility Management in collaboration with Dr. Nick Talbot, Auckland's Air Quality Scientist. A key part of the air quality network is supporting cities to use air quality data and analysis to accelerate action, which was the basis of bringing our two networks together, as Auckland is conducting monitoring studies to both evaluate and make the case for policy. And our mobility management network brings together cities to share strategies, policies, and interventions around urban mobility planning, specifically road user charging and zero emission areas. Auckland is a signatory of C40's Fossil Fuel Free Streets Declaration, and therefore is committed to preparing zero-emission buses and zero-emission areas by 2030. This webinar will build on the narrative of the webinar held 2 weeks ago by our transport team on how cities are implementing ZEAs, and we will share a link to the slides and the recording of this webinar on Exchange during this webinar a bit later. If you'd like to know more about the declaration and ZEAs, please feel free to get in contact with Lucy. In terms of the webinar structure today, Nick will present for 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session for 20 minutes, which Lucy will facilitate. So please write any questions you have for this discussion in the chat box, as it'll be easier for us to moderate. And please do remember to keep yourself on mute to minimize disturbance, as this will make sure we can hear Nick's presentation clearly. Brilliant. Okay, Nick, all yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you ever so much, Dolly, for the introduction, and hello everyone, and thanks for joining. So today's presentation, I've titled it Monitoring Air Quality Impacts in Auckland's Proposed Zero Emission Area. But it's a broad title. Generally, the presentation structure, okay, is going to be the transport as a major polluter within Auckland city centre. So I'm going to just touch on the history and the evolution of the transport network across central Auckland area. I'm going to then describe the rationale for change focusing on air quality data within the city centre. I'm going to focus mainly on NO2 and black carbon for this, and the reasons for this will become clear while I'm describing it. Then we're going to assess the impacts of removing vehicles from city centre. This is touching on the C40 work we've done, both on touching on a congestion charge within the CBD and modelling work we did for that, and also the Fossil Fuel Free Street Agreement declaration that Auckland signed up to. And then we're going to look at the monitoring impacts for the proposed land use and design changes within central Auckland, and also this is also merged with the future design of the Auckland city centre, and this is very much an ongoing and evolving process. Okay, so first of all, let's qualify that transport is the major anthropogenic emission source across Auckland. Look on the right-hand side pie chart, you can see that transport, this was from an emission inventory made up in 2016. You can see that transport accounts for 79% of NOx. This is the entire Auckland 1,000 square kilometre area we're looking at here. And PM2.5 for the whole area, transport is 39%, but Auckland, like the rest of New Zealand, has a propensity to use wood for home heating during winter times. And that's just that winter period. Domestic heating accounts for 50% of PM2.5, okay? But looking just at the Queen Street, our central site, you can see that domestic heating only accounts for 9% of the fine particulate there, but 80% is accounted for by transport, okay? So let's have a quick look at what we're talking about with the city centre area. The city centre is actually defined by the motorway. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but you can see that there's an outline here, and that is actually basically a ring road that goes around the city centre area, okay. Within the downtown area, this photo is actually taken underneath our central monitoring, our central air quality monitoring site, and this is focused downtown towards the waterfront area, and you can see a lovely day there in Auckland, okay. Further up the street, you can see that this is the Queen Street Valley. You can see that it's surrounded by high buildings, and it's actually got, in a lower elevation than those to the west and to the east. So it actually does sit in a valley, which heads from the southwest to the northeast. The northeast is where our harbour is, okay. Here we have our ring road structure, which actually is our main junction area, which is situated to the southwest of the city centre. And this will be the reason I'm pointing this out will become apparent later on. Okay. And then we have the waterfront area of Quay Street, and this is by our port area. It's a busy port that actually comes into the centre of the city. Okay. So let's have a quick look at the evolution of the transport system. So back in 1902, Auckland got its first tram. As you can see, there's quite a fanfare to that. And we had a fossil fuel free pass, okay? By 1940, that tram network had built up into quite a vibrant network. You can see it was an intercoastal tram along the isthmus of Auckland, and we had an excellent public transport network. Of course, the advent of the car, okay. Of course, the advent of the car meant that we had to develop a better road system during the mid 20th century, and so we modernized next, okay. You can see that we suddenly developed a very compact road network through the city centre network, and this actually allowed for a low density development to account for the whole of the Auckland region, okay. Obviously, by the end of the century, you can't keep on just having an urban sprawl going out allowed for by motor vehicles. So by 2003, we built the Britomart Transport Hub in Auckland, and this allowed for a better public transport network to be developed. We have more trains and an increase in buses. But obviously, when you have a low density population, it's very hard then to create a public transport network from that. You have to densify your population to make a viable public transport alternative. So this takes a little bit of time to rectify. Okay. So this slide talks about the city centre now. If we look at the top part of it, we can look at the population. Look at the population explosion within that city centre area. When I'm looking at Auckland city centre, we're talking about a 5 square kilometre area. You can see in 2012, we had 31,000 people resident within that area. That's 2018, that's 57,000 people now resident. We no longer call it a business district, I should say, because so many residents, and it's now a social place where people could go and it's an end destination maybe for a day. And that's the way that we're trying to evolve the city centre area. Number of vehicles going in. It's always good to see how much the transport sector, how do we get people in and out of the city centre? On the bottom chart here, you can see the table, 2017 November, 38,000 people came in by car, 21,000 people by bus, 8,000 people by train. That's 38,000 people, but this was basically about 32,000 vehicles. So it's about, from public transport to the number of private vehicles going in was about the same. It's about the same number of volume back in November. I think now we're slightly more on the public transport side than the private vehicles. Very interesting when I monitored air quality transport data from back in late 1990s, there was actually 40,000 vehicles coming in every day. So there's actually been a drop-off of about 10,000 private vehicles entering the city centre over the past 15 years, which is pretty good. Okay. So I've just touched on the fact that Auckland city centre is now a social and economic heart for Auckland, and it receives over 2 million visitors a year. In the downtown area, which I pointed out, it actually has about 10 million people walking those streets every year. But that Queen Street site in the heart of the city centre has twice as much NO2 than any of our other sites, our 8 monitoring sites across the Auckland network. It's up almost by 40 micrograms per cubic metre, which obviously is the WHO guideline average, annual average for NO2. You can see how much more it is than the citywide bar chart here. So, and you can, that is interesting because even though citywide network locations are really close to motorways, so why is Queen Street so much higher than the other monitoring sites? Okay. We look at the long-term trends here for Queen Street, and you can see that from 2006, concentration has actually dropped quite significantly. There's a couple of interesting points I should point out on this chart. You see the one I'm circling here with the cursor. That's the economic crash during 2009. And you can see that that actually reduced NO2 concentrations quite dramatically. That's quite an indicator of what our key pollutant is in Queen Street. By 2012, pointed out here, hopefully you can see my cursor, we actually see a step change in the concentrations of NO2. And this was actually caused by a reconfiguration of our Queen Street Road. We actually narrowed the road slightly, made it more pedestrian friendly, and also altered the bus route. Okay. Since 2012, you can actually see the trend for Queen Street is slightly reversed. It's now flattened out, and we actually now see a slight increase in NO2 concentrations in Queen Street. This is due to basically people becoming accustomed to driving down Queen Street again, and it's reconfigured, and there hasn't been any reconfiguration since 2012. So the situation is not improving in Queen Street, and anything is decreasing. Yeah. Okay. So this plot might look quite complicated, but there's a couple of key aspects on it that I really want to point out to you. So the first one, okay, is the fact that we're definitely looking at transport emissions here. If you focus on the red line, you can see the two peaks. There's the morning rush hour peak, the afternoon rush hour peak down Queen Street. And this is typical traffic signal for NO2. You can obviously, the green line, the blue line are PM2.5 and PM10. For the sake of this plot, just ignore them. If you have any questions about them later, if you're air quality affiliated, then feel free to ask. Okay. The one I really want to point out, and this is very interesting, is that you see from normalized data, where 1 would be our standard, our annual average concentration, you can see that the peak goes up towards Friday. But look at Saturday and Sunday here. You can see that there's a massive drop-off in NO2 concentration on the weekend. And the reason I point this out is that it's a big shopping district in Queen Street. And actually our traffic counts show that we have the same amount of traffic, normal private vehicles going into Queen Street during the weekend as we do in the week. So what would be the reason for this drop-off in NO2 concentration on the weekend? Okay. So I'm going to point out here the fact that obviously we're not looking at just private vehicles as a cause for NO2 here. What happens on weekend rather than weekdays, of course, is that we have more diesel vehicles. Obviously, we have goods vehicles, we have heavy goods vehicles, we have a lot more buses on the weekday than we have on the weekend. Small inserted plot that you can see here on left-hand side, these are diffusion tube data points that we had collected across Auckland over the last 5 years. The red spots account for those NO2 tubes, which are actually over 40 micrograms per cubic meter. So you see just visually, this is not quite very scientific, but I can show you just by looking that there's clusters of these red spots, very much coordinated, where we see the density of bus stops. And these are actually hatched areas on the main plot here. Okay. Using these very same tubes, okay, is that we see that when Georgie Misko, one student at the University of Auckland, did land use regression on these data points, she modeled the NO2 output looking at 8 different urban variables. So she looked at the number of lanes, summer bus stops, the awnings, vegetation, bus lanes, building footprint, traffic lights, and averages. On my cursor, you can see that the model output, 0 is the average that she got for her total average. You can see that the main points here are the number of lanes of vehicles affected NO2, so that the more lanes there were to a road, the higher the NO2 output. The other thing that you can see here is the building footprint. That's the height of the buildings that surround the road, very important for NO2 concentrations. Okay. But the one I want to point out here is the sum on the density of bus stops in an area with those other two parameters turned out to be very important for NO2 concentrations within the central district. But whereabouts, of course, is the NO2 coming from? Okay. So I did a polar plot looking from 2017, and we've got a live NO2 monitor running at that Queen Street site. And we look at NO2 concentrations with wind speed and direction for 2017. And this plot is quite interesting. All these yellow hatched areas show where our NO2 concentrations would exceed 40 micrograms per cubic meter. You can see that there's, as our diffusion tube plots show, that towards the waterfront area, you have 2 hatched areas. This is our Custom Street and Key Street source. You can see that along Queen Street, which is the local source, we have 1 plot here for low wind. But there's a very interesting plot at a higher wind speed, which I'm now circling now, where we have very high concentrations. And that seems to appear that it seems to point towards a source which is to the southwest or the southern segment of the CBD district. So what I'm pointing out here is the fact that maybe the NO2 is not coming from a direct source within the CBD as well. It's also being brought into the center from a source to the south of the CBD. Okay. So let's touch on this. So I'm going to have a look and see how the concentrations build up in this Britomart and the downtown area. Why is our Queen Street site so much higher than all the other sites? So first of all, okay, you can see that the number of buses on the upper Queen Street area coming into the CBD is 609 per day. This was just taken from a point on a Tuesday in 2017. That makes up 12% of the on-road traffic for that day. Okay. You can see from this plot actually that they don't generally come right the way downtown. They tend to turn off to the left or right, following the cursor here, to serve either the east or west side of the CBD. Only 176 head downtown past our air quality site, which is blue X marks the spot. From the airflow map from our meteorological site downtown, you can see that the airflow, we have a trade wind that comes from the southwest, a very reliable wind that comes from the southwest, but sometimes it comes in from the northeast. So the flow is either coming generally from the southwest, heading towards the waterfront, but sometimes comes from the waterfront. That's very important, okay? Because of course we have our ports and shipping contribution, and that contribution I'll touch on shortly. So when you get the wind from the southwest, you have this large amount of diesel exhaust coming from buses and other heavy goods vehicles traveling down towards the city centre. From the northeast, you get the ports and the shipping contribution coming in from the northeast, okay? And then of course, you've got the Britomart bus station and the buses that feed in from the east and west side. And of course, bus station, you have to have a bus station right in the centre of the city. That's of course a given. But of course, that means that buses are idling there, buses are waiting. And there's also some big junctions coming in along the bottom here. So it's not a smooth trip for the buses to come in and out of the city centre at the moment. So those three factors seem to combine to make this area of downtown Auckland a particular hotspot for NO2 concentrations. And it's not just NO2 concentrations. Okay, we'll look at black carbon now. Black carbon obviously is a portion of our PM2.5. It's actually the smallest portion of our PM2.5 sector. And as these pie charts show, PM2.5, 39% of our PM2.5 taken from source apportionment data. And I should touch on our source apportionment data is a very strong data set. We've got 10 years worth of data collected every 3 days from this Queen Street site. That's over 100,000 different data points. So this is a very strong, statistically robust data set we're looking at here. You can see that PM2.5 on Queen Street, diesel vehicles account for 39% of the PM2.5. Marine aerosol, which is obviously there, even in the PM2.5 sector, is 24%. I'll just note that that's why we don't tend to use PM10 in Auckland, is because so much of it is sea salt, is that it's very misleading to use PM10 for looking at the vehicle exhaust and so forth. Interesting to note here, petrol vehicles for PM2.5, which make up the large majority of our private fleet, 3% of PM2.5 come from petrol vehicles. It'll actually be more for PM10 because you get suspended road dust and you get wear and tear from the actual vehicle itself, which contributes to PM10 concentrations. And there's our 9% from biomass burning. Looking at the pie chart to the right, looking just at the black carbon taken from the same filters as the PM2.5, diesel vehicles now account for 2/3. Sorry, black carbon is now emanates from diesel vehicles, 2/3 of the diesel vehicle concentration. So I'll reiterate that. So diesel vehicles account for 66% of black carbon within our Queen Street site. Interesting. Shipping emissions accounts for 10% of the black carbon. And remember, we'll only get the shipping emission concentrations when the winds come from the northeast. So it's very important to understand that during times when the winds coming from the northeast, that 10% will be a lot higher. Okay. So how does this compare to other cities and other sectors within our Auckland Council district? First of all, looking at our Auckland Council network, okay, Queen Street, given by this bar chart, is far higher than our other air quality stations. I should touch on that Khyber Pass Road has 3 times as many private vehicles traveling along it as our Queen Street site. And yes, Queen Street is much higher for black carbon concentrations. And these again are measured over a long period of time. So it's not vehicles per se which is causing the amount of black carbon in the atmosphere. It's the type of vehicles that are traveling along the road. And that's a very important point to gather. But how do we compare internationally? Okay. Of course, there's difference in methodology. So if of course, like for like, it's always a little hard to actually directly apportion the concentration amounts. But to touch on the differences between Queen Street in Auckland and other studies around the world, you can see that Queen Street is 2.3 to 5.3 micrograms per cubic meter, and this is annual average black carbon concentration. You can see in the United States, over 200 sites, their concentration 0.3 to 2.5 micrograms. In Canada, 0.9 to 1.8 micrograms, 1.4 to 1.8 in Europe, and UK, 1.0 to 2.9. So we are much higher concentrations in Queen Street than we do that we are actually reported elsewhere in Western countries, which is quite interesting. Okay. And that kind of makes this headline that was in our newspaper in just a couple of weeks ago, that rising levels of black carbon in Queen Street can be a heightened health risk for Aucklanders. And that might well be true, and it's definitely it's definitely food for thought. Okay. So let's move on and have a look and see what we're going to do to address air quality issues across the CBD. So first of all, we went off, me and a colleague went over to London in May, and we joined the C40 group, and we modeled the impacts of the congestion of a proposed congestion charge within Auckland CBD. And what the transport sector within Auckland Council actually did is just say, like, what if we charged everybody $10 to come into the city centre area? Let's model it and see what the impacts would be. Okay. What that actually came out to is the fact that that would actually remove 11,000 vehicles from the city centre. So that's 1/3 of the total private fleet coming into the city centre. Okay. So this bar chart shows the blue one is before removing those vehicles, and the red one is after implementing that charge. And you can see for PM 2.5, it's a 4%, it's roughly a 4% reduction in concentration. As I showed on the previous pie chart, that petrol vehicles have a very small contribution to the PM 2.5 concentration. That's not to say they don't have an impact, but for PM 2.5, you can see there's a small reduction. For NO2, for our Queen Street site, it actually reduces NO2 by 15%. Okay. And so we modeled the social and economic impacts of these small concentrations. And you can see from our NO2 concentrations, our NO2 calculations here, that just removing those 11,000 vehicles and taking 15% off our total NO2 concentrations downtown, the number of deaths averted within that 57,000 area would be 6. The life expectancy for the total population in that area would be 31 days. So we give everyone an extra month with a cost economic saving of over $1 million a year. Now, this is very important to put into some perspective, because this area that we're talking about, this 4 square kilometers, it's part of a 1,000 square kilometer area. So it's 0.001% of the total landmass and a population of 0.05% of the total population. And we're still seeing this large social and economic gain from removing vehicles. But of course, we're only taking 15% off by removing 1/3 of the vehicles. That's because we're not generally removing the diesel vehicles from the fleet, i.e. the heavy goods vehicles and the buses from the fleet. We're only removing private vehicles. Okay. And Auckland also signed up to the fossil fuel free agreement. Here we got a picture of our mayor, Phil Goff, and he is quoted as saying, "Zero emission targets for our bus network and our city centre create a framework and impetus for Auckland to contribute to the Paris Agreement our nation signed up to in 2015. He went on, "I am committed to making Auckland greener, healthier and safer for our people." Okay. So how are we going about doing that? Okay. We're creating We're creating a future plan for the Auckland city centre. We've got two maps here of plans which are created from design office and also external consultancies, and also with the Auckland Council and wider Auckland Council family. So on the left-hand side here, you can see that the Queen Street Valley is hatched pink. This is our proposed area where we will actually have a low emission or zero emission area. The hard pink area is the Queen Street Road itself, the 3-kilometre road. And this area here is our Wynyard Quarter. There will also be a traffic calmed area within that. Now the area I'm actually running the cursor along now is a proposed green valley that will actually go from, it's a linear park that will go from Victoria Park over in this western side of the city centre to Albert Park over on the eastern side. So there's a green sector proposed through the heart of the city centre area. And that's quite a transition. Okay. Of course, we can't remove private vehicles from the city centre without giving people an alternative. So we're creating a structure where national, local government and private investment can actually go in to create new infrastructure for trains, for instance, and public transport information. So these here on this slide, I'm showing that we're actually at the moment through the centre of Auckland creating a city rail link construction. Now at the moment, the Britomart has a train line that goes in and out on the same line. It's not a throughway. And of course that restricts capacity to the Britomart area and to downtown. What we're currently developing is a tunnel, which will basically tunnel through the heart of the city centre, which will open stations, the 3 new proposed stations through the city centre area. This will double rail capacity to the city centre, enable an extra 30,000 people to enter and leave the city centre during peak hours. Going through the committee process at the moment is a proposed reintroduction, of course, of our tram network, a light rail network, which will initially go southwest towards the airport, but also hopefully will head out west into West Auckland, which is an area of rapid development. Okay. Ongoing right now, in the next 2 years, we're actually redeveloping our Quay Street and our waterfront area. We're creating a new open, safe space for the public. It's a new bus interchange, which should smooth it, and increased ferry capacity within this waterfront area. And our waterfront area is our key area within Auckland. This is the area where we have 10 million people walking along each year. So it's a very key area for our prosperity of our city. The star here is where we're proposing to build a new air quality site within this area so we can monitor this change. And I'll get to this more in a moment. Okay. So at the moment, this is what our Quay Street site looks like. And you can see people are blocked from our waterfront by a 5-lane road going along Quay Street. Okay. This is the design that will actually come into implementation, which is just about to start in 2019, and it should be completed by 2020. And you can see it's still got a 2-lane road going through it, so people can still access their shops or whatever. But it's no longer, we don't want the city centre to be a through road from east to West Auckland. We want people to follow the motorway around the city centre. And so it's moving people's thoughts forward on that. So getting people, it's changing a mindset of a population as well as a restructuring. So those things have to work symbiotically to create a proper environment for these changes. But you can see the improvement that's proposed here. And now this work is ongoing. So how are we going to monitor these changes? I'll just quickly recap on what these changes are going to be. Okay. So the council has the fossil fuel free agreement, which we're working on, working in conjunction with Auckland Transport and various other bodies as well. So this says that we'll electrify the bus network for the CBD area by 2025. So they'll be posting by 2025, and by 2030, hopefully most of our buses will be. By 2040, we will have mostly electric vehicles fleet for our buses, and also we'll designate a fossil fuel free area, and that's got very strong Auckland Council committee backing, it must be said. At the moment, we've got a master plan refresh, which is the designs that I've shown you now. And this is like an Access for Everyone program. And that's now ongoing at the moment. We had an Auckland Transport Alignment Project, which aligned national, local, and also corporate business to bring in investment, to bring back the light rail, increase cycleway, smart road signalling, and improve the transport infrastructure within Auckland city centre. Auckland Transport have a safer street approach, which they're mandating. There's a spike in, unfortunately, in road accidents recently and road deaths. And to mitigate against that, there's various different policies in place to try and make the roads and our streets a safer place. And also Ports of Auckland have a sustainability plan, which is now being implemented along the ports front. And there's that city rail link, which will also help public access to the city centre. Okay. So how are we going to measure all these changes? We're proposing at the moment to develop a low-cost network for Auckland CBD. Now, this is going to happen in two different parts. First of all, these yellow circles, these different coloured circles, I should point out, highlight areas of particular interest for our city centre. These are our proposed locations for our low-cost centre network. This low-cost centre network has, we're calling it a smart city capacity, and I'll show you the reason for that later. But these areas each define a location of interest for us. So here, for instance, we'll have an urban background site in our Albert Park. We know that we don't have much vehicle exhaust emissions, and there's no change here. So this will be our background concentration information here. We've got Wynyard Quarter, which is projected to change, to have land use changes. As here's our Queen Street Valley. We have 3 different monitors in our Queen Street Valley. Our Key Street area along here will be monitored, and that's about to go in shortly. And our ports area here will also be measured. Along by Spaghetti Junction and down here will be monitored. This one I'm circling right now is called Mercury Lane. Our city rail link proposes to have an entrance and exit for this road I'm pointing out here. This area is monitored by our New Zealand Transport Agency, and it has passive tubes there for the last 10 years. This site always exceeds 550 micrograms per cubic meter for NO2 annually. This is our highest NO2 concentrations anywhere in New Zealand. It's a very important consideration when you're going to put an entrance to a city rail link here. Okay. So what kind of monitors are we going to use? We're planning on using the Vaisala node, the A420. So this will give us generally air pollution data for the PM2.5, PM10, NO2, SO2, and CO. We've gone with the Vaisalas at the moment due to their compatibility with our ongoing monitors that we have. But also they seem to be quite robust, and it's obviously something we trust. Along with air pollution data, and this is important, is that we're going to monitor noise. So the changes in noise level, because we obviously know there's health implications to noise and comfort. Now there's so many residents within our city centre, we have to focus on these sort of wider aspects, not just air pollution, but noise. We're going to monitor pedestrian counts at these areas, so we know we can get a surrogate exposure measurements for this area. We will do traffic counts in these areas, broad traffic counts in these areas, so we know the concentrations of cars before and after we implement these changes, but also social data. We're going to do the economic footfall numbers within these areas. We're going to look at crime figures, accidents, and sort of social factors and economic factors, which are also impactful for these different areas. Moving on from this, we can actually zoom out on this, okay, and broaden these pictures. And we've actually got a private consultancy that's going to deliver not just environmental impacts and social impacts, but a much wider development response, looking at monitoring indicators for the proposed changes to our city centre. Looking at the top here, so we're going to population numbers within these areas where these changes are ongoing. We're going to look at the movement of people, i.e. the number of pedestrians and cycle trips and so forth within this area. So we're going to look at the operations, they're calling it here, but that's basically a number of complaints and the basically having people put out, for instance. Social and public life, so with presentation. So how is it affecting? How are these changes improving or making worse the perceptions of everyday life in these areas, the number of events and the type of events in these areas. What about tourism? Is tourism increasing when now we're actually pedestrianising these areas? Now they're more pleasant areas to spending. Are tourists spending longer in these areas? What about gentrification of the areas? It's like we've heard that areas we've read from other literature, that when areas are pedestrianised and we have these zero emission areas, the value of property increases so much that those areas become slightly gentrified in nature. So we want to know about whether rents increase and vacancy rates and so forth. And then we also look at business and commerce, which is very important, because a lot of the resistance to change in these areas is shopkeepers who are worried that their business will be taken away because people can't park in front of their shops, and parking becomes a difficult aspect for them. So we need to make sure that they are well served within these areas. So it's very important to make sure that we have basically the economic value for the changes for these businesses. Okay. I'm going to leave you with this statement, which I'm actually publicising at the moment. And this kind of brings it all together, that we're not just looking at air quality issues when we're looking at land use and infrastructure changes anywhere. We're looking at a broader scope. So policy decisions that promote safer streets, climate action, active and public transport modes, as well as congestion mitigation strategies, have multiple and interdependent benefits. Okay. These include increased economic activity, vibrant social spaces, and a cleaner, more sustainable environment, including cleaner air. Thank you. And thank you for listening.
Nick, thank you so much. That was a brilliant talk. Great discussions on how you're using your monitoring data, the social and economic impacts of poor air quality, but also a taster of how you're refreshing your city centre master plan. So thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Lucy.
If our cities who are on the line would be able to put any questions that they might have into the chat box. But I've got a question here for you, Nick. Kick us off. So several of our cities are on the cusp of delivering their own zero emission areas. Can you share any useful advice on any key issues that cities should be thinking of in terms of air quality monitoring when they're in these early stages of implementing their zero emission areas?
You've got to get business buy-in. One of the resistance to change in some of our key areas, the fact that businesses are very reticent about giving up the parking spaces in front of their shops, and they don't necessarily believe that their business will improve and the number of people visiting their shops will increase if you remove people's ability to ride in on their private, in their cars, for example. So you're trying to you have to convince, there is a public perception that you're going to lose business. And so businesses want to keep the parking spaces in front of their shops. They think people will buy more and visit more often if they can park in front. And it's a very slow, it's a psychological perception of this. So you need to prove to people that where you actually take away vehicles and get people in private vehicles, they spend longer in the area physically and will spend more economically in those shops. So I think you need to build a body of evidence to show that. And once you do, maybe you'll actually get a knock-on effect and you'll increase people's willingness to promote these zero-emission areas.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely a challenge that I know London has faced, and some evidence-based research has gone into proving how footfall can actually help local businesses and things like that. So I'll try and dig out that research and share it with the cities who are on the line right now. We've got a couple of other questions in the chat box. So could you please describe Auckland's public engagement strategy for developing the zero emission area, the public response, and how effective air quality monitoring data was in making the case?
There was many different factors involved in bringing forward, bringing forward the changes that are proposed through Auckland City Centre. There was obviously there's a mandate for change through the signing of the Declaration for the Fossil Fuel Free Agreement. That was obviously a key factor in this. There's obviously also a need that we've already made it more pedestrian friendly in Queen Street, and everyone saw that once we actually made the pavements wider and we slightly narrowed Queen Street, the number of people now walking down Queen Street there's about 3 times as many people now traveling that street as there were about 8 years ago when it was less. So they can see that there is a connection between the amount of space you give people to walk or to cycle or whatever, and the more people that visit that area. So you can kind of see, but to get that message across, we've been trying to talk to the public about it. I was telling my colleague here that just last week I was out in one of the public squares, and we had notice boards showing designs of what Auckland, these plans that I showed you, and giving it for public consultation, actually in public squares. And people were coming over and asking questions, and some of them critical, some of them positive, but then it gave people a chance to discuss worries they have, and also it brought attention to the plans that we're having. Some people are excited for it, some people obviously are reticent for these changes for the reasons I've just said. Air quality is part of the mix, as I sort of said on that last slide, in my last statement. It's not just air quality issues that we're looking at here. Air quality for Auckland, of course, is not a massive factor, but it's built in. There's so many the co-benefits in creating these areas. One of them is creating a public space where children can, run around, and you can take kids into the city centre. You can open up kindergartens there safely, and it's a safer area, safer streets areas. It lowers crime, as we said, and it increases footfall. We're sure of that. So there's many wins, but you've got to prove it. So it's a matter of developing a structure where you can still allow people to come in as well. When I told you about the increase in infrastructure that's needed, that city rail link's taking years to develop. So to build the capacity to get people in other than in the private vehicles. So you can't just do one thing on its own. You need to build the capacity to make the changes over a long period of time. It's not just something that can happen overnight, I think. If you suddenly cut people's ability to travel on their private vehicles like tomorrow, but didn't give them alternatives, you're going to turn people's public views against it, and that will be harmful in the long run when you're trying to make these changes. It's important to do things in a structured and well-ordered manner.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Okay, I've got another question from Anne here. On freight, would privately owned heavy goods vehicles in the zero emission area be required to be emission free, and by what year?
I'm sorry, could you just, sorry, I didn't catch the end of that. Could you just go again, Lucy?
Of course. Would privately owned heavy goods vehicles in the area be required to be emission free? And if so, by what year do you see this being implemented?
Okay, well, we can't control the privately, the large heavy good vehicles. There is an infrastructure in place where we want to have electric vehicles that would have delivery points going in, sort of like an access for everyone. So we have basically spots within the CBD where these vehicles would drop off goods and services, and then they would be further delivered to these areas by electric fleet. I know that the ports at Auckland at the moment are looking at putting a hydrogen plant within their area. And what they're hoping to do is increase, because obviously these heavy good vehicles, you can't battery pack a HGV necessarily very effectively. It's better for hydrogen. So working with various different consultancies, we're looking at bringing hydrogen into the mix for Auckland. And hopefully that we can start to run some of these vehicles on hydrogen. They can't actually stop other vehicles coming in because it's obviously vital that we can, but we've electrified the train fleet rather than diesel trains, which has improved things. But for the heavy goods vehicles, hopefully hydrogen might be an option going forward, but we only have a certain amount of control on this. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, that's great. And hydrogen vehicles are definitely something that C40 and their zero emission freight network are looking at. So something that we can definitely talk about in the future. Okay, a further question from Irene. how did you choose where to place the monitors? And what city data did you find key to develop an air quality monitoring design plan? Any general advice for a city setting up a community monitoring plan for testing the impact of sustainability interventions?
Oh, okay. A couple of questions there. I'll talk about the air quality monitors. So we looked at the areas. First of all, we want to monitor the changes before, during, and after these processes have changed, so we can see what the impacts and the effects are. So that's my very first. That was my very first look on where to place these monitors. We have. I mean, I've only touched on some of the data that we have. I'm releasing a report later this week, which brings together all emissions within the city centre to focus on areas where we know that we have peak concentrations. And a lot of these are student works that never published, and some were just in master's theses, and others are parts of other projects. Brought it all together to actually bring a dossier which actually looks at these high concentration, low concentrations, and where we have it. So I said we need a background site, so we've got Albert Park. We know that we don't get high concentrations there. We're also looking at areas where there's going to be a lot of change, i.e. where pedestrianisation might happen in the next few years. So we're going to put monitors there so we can see the difference before and after. And that kind of validates or otherwise these changes as we go forward. Bringing the social data together is very important for a wider aspect. I'm not controlling, that last slide was actually from a consultancy, not from us. I'm delivering information through that consultancy so they can put it all together. But I'm very interested in personal exposure in these areas and how that might change over time from an air quality and noise perspective as well. And obviously, because there's so many more people now living in the CBD and are residents, and many more people visiting the city centre as well than there were a few years ago, we need to make sure those people have a good time and are safe in our city. So we're trying to make sure that we get the right information. We're also now putting that into a public space as well. We have now a live web portal which actually shows data to people. Does that answer those questions, or was there another question at the end there? I can't remember.
Let me just double check. Any general advice for a city? Any general advice for a city setting up a community monitoring plan?
You need to look at your past data, I think, first of all. So you need to know what you're looking at. Like, as I gave in the presentation, it's not all cities. Some cities have a lot of industry, for instance. Other cities might have, still have coal powered for independent power and things like this. I mean, we have a home heating source, but we don't have it in the city centre per se. So we're quite, well, not lucky in the city centre, but we're looking at generally a transport emission source within this area. Obviously, if we move away from this, we have to look at other emission aspects, but we're looking very much at one source. So we know what we're dealing with. First of all, we know the areas because we've done a lot of research on this. We know the areas to focus on. And of course, we've now got the proposed changes coming in from our various different planning offices and other commercial bodies. So we know the areas to focus on where the changes are going to happen. We know what problem areas we're going to have. We've identified the instrumentation. We're going to have to monitor these changes, and we've got the people involved who can actually deal with the data once it comes in. So we've got basically all our ducks in a row, so we'll be able to monitor these sections. So I think those different 4 or 5 components are essential before you set up a smart city capacity.
Brilliant. Well, as soon as your report is published, if you're happy to share it with us, that would be excellent. Let me and Dolly know, and we can distribute it to our networks.
Okay, certainly. It'll be coming out in the next couple of days, I think. A little Christmas present for everyone.
Absolutely. Weekend reading.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Okay, another question here from Juma. Thank you for the nice presentation. I'd like to ask, why don't you choose the entire city? Why don't you choose to monitor the entire city of just, instead of focusing only on the CBD? This way you'd be able to have background concentrations that affect the entire city, and the data that could accurately reflect emissions coming from different pollution sources.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, as I said, like, we're looking at a 5 square kilometre area. Auckland itself is covered by 1,000 square kilometres. we'd need a lot of transmitters to cover 1,000 square kilometers. What we're hoping to do, as I pointed out during the presentation, you need to build a body of evidence that this works, is that it does have a meaningful and lasting impact, which is positive on both environment, social and economic factors within the CBD, within any area, not just the city centre. So we use the city centre because it's rapidly development. It is about 40% of our GDP for Auckland. So it's an important area within the city itself. What we're hoping to do is to extrapolate the information that we actually gain from the city centre to our other major public, populated areas within the city centre. This goes back to work we're doing for climate, I should point out, because these areas, we're working very much on a climate programme at the moment for Auckland. And so we're looking at one of the areas for climate is obviously looking at various different mitigation strategies. And to have the information for them going forward is also important. So we will look to spread this out across the greater Auckland region. But first of all, we're using the city centre as a study area for these changes. First of all, once we know that we've got things working correctly and our information is coming in correctly, and there is obviously a positive outcome to these changes, we can then extrapolate that information and set up detectors in various different areas. We are actually setting up different sensor networks, actually South Auckland and in various areas as well, but we're focusing on the city centre for these particular changes.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, we've got from Maria, good presentation. It's an inspiration to Quito, who are implementing the very first steps of their zero emission area in their downtown. And you are inspiring them to be ambitious and to think bigger. So a bit of a shout out from Quito. But then I've got a question from got a question from Aaron. Thank you for a great presentation, Nick. Are you striving to overcome transport-related equity issues through your zero-emission area? And if so, how? And then second part, how is air quality monitoring helping to achieve this?
Well, yeah, no, it really hasn't been a focus of our work at all, looking at the equity issue of transport. This is a bit outside our remit for looking at air quality issues and infrastructure changes. Obviously, you have to allow access for everyone, so we don't foresee any large price increases or transport network, but it's a matter of scale, I guess. So we've increased the bus capacity already within the city centre, within the city per se, which allows public transport access. And hopefully, as we develop our public transport capacity, then more people use it, and basically the weight of cost versus the number of people obviously keep prices at a reasonable level. Air quality issue is obviously, because it wasn't a major factor, that I can't really address the air quality issue as part of this particular question. Sorry, Aaron. Hopefully I answered your question a bit there.
Thank you very much. And I think we've got a question from Dolly here.
Thanks, Dolly.
Thanks, Lucy, and thanks, Nick. Brilliant presentation. So yeah, I have a quick question. So really interesting to hear if there were any gaps in data that Auckland identified during the process, so during the studies, and if there are any types of data analysis or communications that the city would have carried out differently to make this rollout smoother.
Yeah, interesting question, because obviously for the central city area, we only have one monitoring station, and as everybody probably knows, is like when you have a large built-up area with very complex airflows, one side of the street can monitor completely different from the other side of the street. So to make one single receptor point within the city centre a point for the whole, a representative for that whole 5 kilometre area is a bit of a push. That's why we need these small sensors, and that's why I developed a report which brings together all data from basically diffusion tubes and for people walking with different monitors and these sort of aspects. So there were plenty. We're proposing a second regulatory monitoring site, as I said, in our peak site down on Custom Street by Key Street, where those changes are proposed very shortly. So we're not just looking at these lower cost sensors, we're also looking at putting in another site down there in our peak area, so we get better concentrations. But there was definitely gaps in knowledge, and that's why I developed this report basically. that will come out shortly. And that's to try and put all the data that we have together, either published or unpublished, to try and fill those gaps in knowledge, and to build basically a dossier of information that makes sure that we're addressing the right issues.
Great, thank you, Nick. That's really helpful. And it is a challenge that many of the cities within the air quality network do face, and how important it is, how valuable it is to have like a reference, a regulatory site you can use to monitor multi-pollutants, so you can have that anchor to then build out more ambitious monitoring, looking at different types of studies, and how valuable it is to have a reference site to then develop ambitious research and effective policy. Great, I'm going to pass over to Lucy
Cool.
now.
Brilliant. Now, do we have any other questions from any of the cities that are on the line? We've got about 4 minutes left, so we can test Nick a little bit more.
Thanks, Lucy. Before I have my breakfast, huh?
I know it's very early for you. Thank you so much.
No?
Okay, well, I think let's wrap things up there. Nick, thank you so much for giving us the time this morning and delivering a great presentation. Great questions from the cities and our colleagues on the line, and it definitely gives us all some food for thought. And as Quito highlights, it's very inspiring to hear about the ambitions of Auckland, and hopefully it's inspiring our cities to be more ambitious with their air quality monitoring, and also designing and implementing their zero emission areas. Now there's a poll at the end of this webinar with 2 questions. So it's just been launched, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to fill in the poll. But one last time, thank you so much, Nick, and we will be in touch with you very soon.
Thank you very much for having me and inviting me to do this, and thank you for joining, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Okay, catch up soon. Bye.